This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. European finance ministers agreed to loan Greece about $172 billion at a meeting in February in Brussels. Luxembourg's Prime Minister, Jean-Claude Juncker, announced the agreement. After a meeting of at least, 13 or 14 hours, we have reached a far-reaching agreement on Greece's new program and private sector involvement that will lead to a very significant debt reduction for Greece. Under the plan, Greece's private creditors will lose more than half of the face value of their investments. The agreement also means the country will receive its second financial rescue in less than 2 years. The new loans will likely let the Greek government make a $19 billion payment on its debt by March 20th. Now, Greece must negotiate the terms of its loans with individual banks and other investors. But these creditors will have to hurry. Greece can dictate its own terms once it reaches agreement with 2/3 of its creditors. Not everyone believes Greece will be able to repay its loans. The Fitch Financial Services Company cut the credit rating of Greece. Fitch said it remains highly likely that the country will fail to meet its financial responsibilities. The Greek Parliament has agreed to the idea of spending and job cuts demanded by the European Union and the International Monetary Fund. The Parliament has to pass all 79 measures included in a reform plan before getting the rescue loans. Prime Minister Lucas Papademos has said his country has a lot of work to do before it can receive new aid. At the same time, protests continue in Greece over budget-cutting measures. Many Greeks say they have sacrificed enough. But Greece's EU neighbors are unlikely to release new loans until the budget cuts are in place. The head of the EU delegation to the United States, Ambassador João Vale de Almeida, told VOA that the Union has learned from the crisis. We learned a lot about the means that we need to have to deal with emergency situations. We didn't have them before. We developed them to deal with the cases like Greece and a few other countries. Secondly, we learned that our governance system was not yet at the right level of sophistication. And we are, in fact, changing a lot. If not, there is a small revolution going on inside the euro area in the way we deal with what we call the economic governance. There is a lot being changed. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Officials in Washington recently lost a ruling over their power to enforce competition on the Internet. Now the Federal Communications Commission has a new plan. The FCC currently defines high-speed Internet as an information service. As such, its powers to set rules for broadband service have never been clearly recognized. But telephone service is a recognized area for the agency to regulate. So the FCC proposes to redefine broadband as a telecommunications service. Congress could give the agency clearer powers over broadband. But FCC Chairman Julius Janikowski calls his plan a third way. He says the Commission would act narrowly and enforce only parts of existing law. He says the government is not regulating the Internet. The changes are meant to support net neutrality, the idea that all web traffic should be treated equally. The ruling by a federal appeals court in April involved Internet service provider Comcast. The judges ruled that the FCC had no legal basis for an effort to keep Comcast from limiting access to some services over its network. The company said file-sharing users were slowing its traffic. Broadband providers say regulating them would hurt investment. Verizon Communications called the chairman's plan legally unsupported. As it happens, the plan was announced on May 6th, the same day as the flash crash on American stock markets. The Dow Jones Industrial Average briefly suffered a severe drop. On May 18th, the Securities and Exchange Commission announced new circuit breakers to support orderly trading. The plan involves the Standard & Poor's list of 500 stocks. Stock exchanges have agreed to temporarily halt trading of any stock that rises or falls 10% or more within 5 minutes. The rules will be re-examined in 6 months and could be expanded. And in another development, the Senate voted on May 20th to permit final debate and a vote on a financial reform bill. The House of Representatives has passed its own bill already. The House and Senate versions will need to be combined into final legislation for President Obama to sign into law. The proposed changes in financial rules are the most extensive since the 1930s. The President says the aim is not to punish banks, but to protect the larger economy and the American people. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
I'm Alex Villarreal with the VOA Special English Economics Report. Egypt is the biggest of the nations hit by recent protests in North Africa and the Middle East. One of the causes of this spreading wave of popular dissatisfaction is a lack of economic progress. Egypt is not a major oil exporter. Its economy is not big enough to affect world economic growth. But important pipelines cross Egypt, and Egypt controls the Suez Canal. About 8% of world shipping passes through this link between Europe and Asia. That includes 2 million barrels of oil each day, mainly to Europe. Many experts say they expect the canal to remain open. Still, concerns about the Suez have pushed oil prices to their highest levels since 2008. Fariborz Gadar heads the Center for Global Business Studies at Penn State University. He says poverty in Egypt remains high, up to 40% in some areas. Yet Egypt is not alone. Foreign investors worry about corruption, mismanagement, and security problems across North Africa and the Middle East. Every year, millions of young people enter the job market. Populations are young and growing fast. In Egypt, the economy grew about 5% last year. Too little growth to create enough jobs. Fariborz Gadar says the United States in a good year creates fewer than 2 million jobs. He says Europe and the U.S. together generate 3 million jobs. Middle Eastern countries have to generate up to 8 million jobs just to keep their youth employed. Fariborz Gadar says protests could spread to bigger economies. He says the mismanagement of the Iranian economy could cause protests by the Iranian population because food prices and inflation are increasing. In recent years, the World Bank has praised Egypt for cutting barriers to trade. But economist Deborah Hewitt at the College of William and Mary in Virginia says private foreign investment remains weak. She says those investments have grown quickly from almost nothing 8 years ago. But they are still not enough to lift the economy. Professor Hewitt says Egypt could look to reforms in Morocco that have appealed to investors. Morocco has strengthened its education system and invested in roads, ports, and electric power. She says investments like these not only put people to work, they also create the basis for future economic and political development. For VOA Special English, I'm Alex Villarreal. This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. This year's Consumer Electronics Show opened January 7th in Las Vegas, Nevada. The event is the world's biggest technology trade show. More than 300 companies presented more than 20,000 new products. The goals are to build excitement, make deals, and get good reviews in the media. Industry sales dropped 8% last year during the recession. Gary Shapiro, president of the Consumer Electronics Association, predicted that one area of strong sales this year will be mobile phones. That includes 52 million smartphones expected to be sold in the United States. Smartphones run applications and access the internet. Google is launching the Nexus One, which it calls a superphone. This is its first attempt to sell its own device. The Nexus One will compete with Apple's popular iPhone. Apple is reportedly about to introduce a new digital tablet. Tablets are easy-to-hold screens that let you read and watch media or search the web. An example is the Amazon Kindle. Like netbooks, tablets cost less than traditional laptop computers. But that can also mean smaller profits for manufacturers and sellers. Companies like Sony and Panasonic are introducing new television sets for watching three-dimensional TV. A 3D TV costs more than $3,000. Americans are expected to buy 4 million of them this year. Sports broadcaster ESPN and the Discovery Channel plan to start their own 3D channels. The Consumer Electronics Show had an area for companies to demonstrate products that save energy, reduce waste, and use recycled materials. Show spokeswoman Jennifer Beamisterfer says the Sustainable Planet Tech Zone was 4 times bigger than last year. She says manufacturers are increasingly interested in the idea of cradle-to-cradle technology. That involves thinking about a product's whole lifetime. Interest is also growing in energy management systems for the home and safe driving technologies for the car. These include voice-activated systems that let drivers make calls and send text messages without using their hands. Other products warn drivers if they are falling asleep or in danger of an accident. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report. To post comments or to send us questions, go to voaspecialenglish.com.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Energy has become an important issue in the American presidential campaign. And gasoline prices, costs that affect almost all Americans, have risen sharply in recent months. For example, former Massachusetts Governor Mitt Romney has criticized President Obama's energy policy. In a newspaper commentary, he said the president has let prices rise while placing too many requirements on the energy industry. One issue in the political debate is a project proposed by the Canadian company TransCanada. Its Keystone XL pipeline would stretch more than 3,000 kilometers from Alberta, Canada, to several oil processing centers in the United States. If completed, the project would cost about $13 billion and transport over 1 million barrels of oil a day. The Republican Party has criticized President Obama for delaying work on the oil pipeline. Republican Doc Hastings serves in the United States Congress. He says the party wants to use all of the nation's energy resources. Mr. Hastings says that would include use of both the Keystone XL pipeline and oil exploration in coastal waters. He says Republicans in the House of Representatives have passed reforms that break down government barriers to America's natural resources. And he says the House has passed legislation that would open coastal areas to new oil exploration and production. In early March, President Obama visited a Daimler truck factory in North Carolina. He told workers that more oil exploration is not an easy answer to the nation's energy problems. He said the United States has 2% of the world's oil reserves, but uses 20% of the world's oil. He said this means that even with increased oil production, there is no easy answer to high gasoline prices. Workers at the North Carolina factory build alternative fuel vehicles. Mr. Obama told them that new sources of energy mean more jobs. The president has called for tax breaks on clean energy vehicles and urged local governments to buy them. He also has asked lawmakers to end $4 billion in support for the oil and gas industries. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Prasuti. You can download texts and MP3s of our programs and learn English at voaspecialenglish.com. From VOA Learning English, this is the Economics Report in Special English. European Union countries have struggled to find common ground as they tried to work out a budget agreement in Belgium. But this month, they agreed on the European Union's Multi-Annual Financial Framework, or MMF, for the period from 2014 to 2020. The MMF sets the EU's yearly spending at about $1.3 trillion. That is 1% of the income of the EU. Members agreed to reduce total spending by more than 3% for the period. This is the first time that members have accepted cutting costs. European Council President Herman van Rompuy spoke after the agreement was announced. He said the compromise budget might not be perfect, but he said it should help all EU members. German Chancellor Angela Merkel praised the long-term spending plan. She said the agreement makes policy more predictable and enables members to act in Europe's interest. Some EU leaders have been calling for greater spending controls in their home countries. They wanted the EU to show that it too is willing to cut costs. British Prime Minister David Cameron welcomed the agreement. Before the two-day meeting in Brussels, he had threatened to veto the budget if there were no steps toward reducing spending. But the agreement still might not succeed. The European Parliament must approve the measure. And some members of the Parliament say it fails to deal with many problems, like the sharp differences in wealth between rich and poor people. If the measure is approved, it will affect 28 European Union countries. The EU says Croatia is expected to join the group in July. For VOA Learning English, I'm Carolyn Presutti.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. Leaders of the European Union say they will help Greece as it struggles under a mountain of debt. They promise to take action, if needed, to safeguard financial stability in the euro area as a whole. But the leaders did not announce any detailed plan for Greece after meeting in February in Brussels. They said that was because Greece has not requested any financial support. European Commission President José Manuel Barroso said this means the government believes it does not need the support. Investors had a mixed reaction to the statements from Brussels. Worries over Greek debt have pushed the euro to its lowest value in months against the dollar. European Union finance ministers discussed the situation when they met in the Belgian capital in February. 16 of the 27 nations in the European Union use the euro as their currency. Now, the stronger members are seeking ways to help the weaker ones, like Greece. European Union rules limit the choices for a rescue. The European Central Bank and national central banks are barred from aiding members by purchasing their debt. European officials hope to avoid the crisis that could spread if Greece fails to pay its debts. Greece needs to borrow more than $70 billion this year to finance its budget and refinance its debts. In October, Greece said its budget deficit would reach almost 13% of its gross domestic product last year. GDP is the widest measure of economic activity. Greece represents less than 3% of the euro area economy, but its deficit is around 4 times the level permitted by the euro group. Greece has promised to cut public spending in an effort to reduce its deficit by 4 percentage points this year. And Greece is not the only country in trouble. High levels of public debt in Ireland, Portugal, and Spain are also worrying debt markets. Nations in the euro area share a common currency, but not a common financial policy. This leads to big differences in economic results. Some members have very low levels of public debt. Others have very high levels. Greece's debt could reach 120% of its GDP this year. In February, the European Commission approved a Greek plan to cut government spending. Thousands of public employees in Greece held a strike to protest cost-cutting measures. And that's the VOA Special English Economics Report.
This is the VOA Special English Economics Report. On November 30th, the European Central Bank took action to support the worldwide financial system. Central banks in Britain, Canada, Japan, Switzerland, and the United States also acted. The banks made it less costly for other countries to borrow American dollars. The United States Federal Reserve said the joint effort was meant to help central banks in Europe provide financial support to nations that need it. The action sent American stock prices up more than 3%. On December 1st, European Central Bank President Mario Draghi suggested that the ECB may provide new financial support for European countries struggling with debt. But first, he said, Euro area countries must establish trust by enacting big financial reforms. He said, a credible signal is needed to give ultimate assurance over the short term. What I believe our economic and monetary union needs is a new fiscal compact, a fundamental restatement of the fiscal rules, together with the mutual fiscal commitments that Euro area governments have made. 17 members of the European Union share the euro currency. Concern over its future has been building in recent years. The Greek debt crisis, rescue loans for Ireland and Portugal, and worries over Italy's debt have all increased fears that Europe may have to abandon the euro. The euro is the world's second most traded and second most used reserve currency after the dollar. European finance ministers failed to agree in November on a plan to provide economic support for debt-troubled countries. Financial officials say a lack of economic and financial cooperation is at the heart of the 2-year-old debt crisis. Dutch Finance Minister Jan Kees de Jager said there is a strong need for tougher rules. Lack of economic reforms and lack of fiscal discipline has brought us into this crisis. So you also have to address these fundamental issues. That means Euro nations may have to surrender some power over their budgets to the European Union. For VOA Special English, I'm Carolyn Persutti. We have more programs at voaspecialenglish.com, where people can read, listen, and learn English with texts, MP3s, and activities. We also offer English lessons at the VOA Learning English page on Facebook.